Okay, welcome to session 5, and we are going to look at a little more specialized areas of biblical chronology. I'll be honest with you, my goal here is as much to give you some handouts for later use as to discuss a whole lot here, but I'll use this as an excuse to do that. We do actually have a little more to discuss here in the period of the Judges. You remember how the period of the Kings was a real conundrum for a long time? That has largely been true of the period of the Judges too. It has been a bit difficult to fit the various data that we have into a chronology that makes sense. But I think we are now there. Andrew Steinman wrote an article in the Journal of Evangelical Theological Society, "The Mysterious Numbers of the Book of Judges." Does that sound familiar to you at all? From Edwin Thiele's "The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings." He's playing off that because he thinks he's solved now the dates for the Judges. I can't recapture the entire gist of that article, but I would tell you, in my estimation, probably the major contribution that he has made has to do with at the end of this period. So on this chart, we have a division between periods that are green and periods that are red. That may be a little different color on your handout, but it's going to be close. And those are periods of oppression and periods of peace in the Judges' time frame. And if you look toward the end, we have two, the Ammonites and the Philistines, that overlap. And that's I think a significant contribution that Andrew Steinman has made there. If you look at Judges chapter 10, verse 7, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the sons of Ammon. So both of those oppressions are mentioned here beginning at the same time. They afflicted and crushed the sons of Israel that year. For 18 years they afflicted the sons of Israel who were beyond the Jordan, in Gilead and in the land of the Amorites. If you skip down to Judges 13, the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, so that the Lord gave him into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. And what Steinman suggests is that these two periods of oppression actually overlap. And I think he's correct because it works. Once you take account of that, and we've got a number of different judges in that period, the dates seem to fall out quite well. So that's the chronology that I would suggest is most helpful for the period of the Judges, and the one that I've given you essentially on your handout. That also appears on the little foldable chart that I gave you earlier. I always find it interesting to compare and contrast and try to align the lives of various people that we read about in the biblical text. This particular chart gives the transition from the time of the Judges to the initial kings of Israel. And you can see, beginning with David at the very end, the overlap that he had with King Saul, the overlap that Saul had with Samuel, and of course Samuel's overlap with Eli, and then how that lines up with the end of the Judges period. We've got some Philistine oppression there that essentially ends, at least the official end, at the beginning of the reign of Saul. Ammonite oppression going on at the same time. Samson is during that period. That would make Samson alive and in ministry, if you will, at the same time as Eli. And Samuel would have, in all likelihood, would have known him as well when he was a kid, when Samuel was a kid. Saul may very well have known Samson. So there's some interesting interconnections you can make when you begin to lay these things out on a timeline. And I think I'm going to let the Judges period rest there and move on to our second specialized period, which is the exile and return. And some of this I would just like to expose you to, not that you'll necessarily remember all of this. We had 3 major deportations of people out of the land at the end of the kingdom of Judah. The first one was in 605 BC. By the way, Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king that did all of these, and 605 was his first year of reign. And so in Nebuchadnezzar's very first year, he came up against Jerusalem and deported a bunch of people, and Daniel was in that group. He was just a young kid at that time, but Daniel was taken off to Babylon for the rest of his life, beginning with that deportation in 605 BC. There was a second deportation by Nebuchadnezzar in 597. Among the notables that were deported at that time would have been Ezekiel, the prophet. And then the third deportation, the third major deportation, was in 587 at the time when Jerusalem was sacked. And there were some minor deportations or lesser deportations after that as well, when additional people were taken out of the land. But those are the major 3. And 587 also marks the end of the kingdom of Judah, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple that Solomon had built. Just a whole lot of things going on there. Side note here, you'll read the date 586 in some works, and some do 587/586. I believe this one has actually been settled now as 587 being the correct date, but you will see a little bit of variation on there, especially in older works, but in some of the more recent ones too. There was a return at the end of the Babylonian kingdom when that empire was sacked, destroyed, ended by the Medo-Persian kingdom. And so in 538, we have a return of Jews to the land of Israel, the land of Judah, the province of Yehud, as they referred to it, led by Sheshbazzar. The temple was finished, rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Joshua in the 4-year period from 520 to 516. There was a return under Ezra, or by Ezra, in 458. And then Nehemiah, we believe, came back in about 445, perhaps 444 BC. So you can see those laid out there as well, along with a couple of other biblical figures, some prophets, when they ministered. We think Malachi was at the end of that period, probably the last of the prophets. You can see Esther there during the life of Xerxes the first. Fascinating period to study. I just wanted to kind of give you a sketch of that. We could fill in tons and tons and tons of other information there. But if you're interested in that, it's not difficult to find. These dates are not really subject to much controversy. They're all pretty well fixed. Just a matter of how interested you are in digging them up. I also wanted to give you a handout on the life of Daniel, just because there's an entire book that he has written, passed down to us, and lay out for you there some of the events from his life. I've also laid out chapters. It's an interesting book because it has two sections, a narrative section and then a visions section. And the narrative section, which goes up through chapter 6, is in chronological order. And the vision section is too, but it goes back in time with chapter 7. So the two chronological sections overlap, and you can see those laid out there. He had an extraordinarily long life, lived through the long rule of Nebuchadnezzar, as well as a number of the guys that followed after him, some of whom are named in the text and some of whom are not. And then he continued to function during the Medo-Persian Empire, had interaction and served under a number of those kings as well. It's interesting and fun to see some of how this is laid out. The beginning of his life overlapped with the prophecies, the ministry of Jeremiah. And in fact, he makes reference to Jeremiah's writings in Daniel chapter 9. The end of his life overlaps with the rebuilding of the temple after the first return. He was thrown into the lion's den toward the end of his life. He was an old man at that point. That's funny. Go Google Daniel in the lion's den, and you'll come up with a bunch of pictures of him also as a young man, somebody that hasn't taken the time to study out the chronology of his life. But he was an old codger at that point, not a lion fighter. So I have given you more in your handouts on the intertestamental period than what I have up here for slides. I didn't want to go through it all with you, and partly because it's not controversial by any stretch. But just to give you a quick flyover of those periods, the Babylonian period marked the end of Judah, the kingdom of Judah. That's followed by the Persian period, which was fairly lengthy and ended with the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. Darius III was the final king of Persia, and he was whooped by Alexander in several battles and finally killed. Alexander, of course, did not last terribly long himself, and his kingdom split up into multiple other kingdoms. It fragmented, but we refer to that as the Hellenistic period or the Greek period. You could refer to it from the perspective of ancient Judah as the Ptolemaic Seleucid period, because control of that province went back and forth between the Seleucids in the north and the Ptolemies in the south. In 167, the Maccabees revolted against the Seleucids and began the process of forming their own kingdom. You might be familiar with the name of Judas Maccabeus, one of the better known figures. He was one of 5 brothers during that period. We also refer to that as the Hasmonean period because it can be named after an ancestor named Hasmon. So you can name it after Hasmon, the father of Mattathias, the father of Judas Maccabeus, or you can name it after Judas Maccabeus and call it the Maccabean period. It's the same thing. So that kingdom stood until the invasion by the Roman general Pompey. Pompey installed a king in 63 BC, one of the Hasmonean kings, but he was basically a puppet ruler. And it wasn't long after that we see the rise of Herod the Great in about 40 BC, 36. And that began a Herodian dynasty. Herod himself ruled, and then his descendants ruled under the Romans, but we still refer to that as the Herodian period until the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and that in some ways then begins the true Roman period, although Rome was in control also during the Herodian period. But Herodian would refer to the Herod the Great, to the destruction of the temple, that 150 years. So that's just a very general, high-level overview of the intertestamental period. And again, your handouts have a lot more detailed information on some of those things. And I think with that, we'll move on to session 6.